Hello and welcome to the Think Liberty podcast. I'm Vinny Marshall, and I am still with her, in case you were wondering. On this episode 25, we are going to discuss a little bit about philosophy, political philosophy. Now, we had a different episode lined up, and we had some issues last night. My computer decided to quit the team, take a dump, as it were. I had to reformat, so we're doing something a little different, and we're just going to have kind of an open discussion. And I've got some good friends here who are quite knowledgeable on the topic of philosophers. Joining me this evening is Chris Oglesby. Chris, how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great.
Fantastic. Glad to hear that. And William Gadsden, also the host of Liberty Bites and Liberty on the Rocks. How's it going, buddy?
It's going good, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining. So, let's jump right into it. We're going to let William get started here because we were figuring it's probably best to go as far back as the dial can take us. So we're going to start with what we're calling some of the ancient philosophers. And without further ado, why don't you take over here, buddy?
I appreciate it. So basically, as you said, to start from the very beginning, if we're going to look at the history of political philosophy, we have to start with the ancients. So Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, a lot of these characters that, a lot of people know the names. They understand that these guys were seen as very smart, very wise, but they don't really know a whole lot else about them. So specifically, if we're going to walk through the entire history, it's really important that we are able to kind of compare and contrast the major players in political philosophy. So the Greeks as a whole, as a culture, one of the first writings I read with Greek political philosophy was from Thucydides, and he's at a sort of a mass funeral after this big battle that Athens had fought, and he's praising Athens to the skies. So, we have these grand walls and armies, and we have the best artisans. People can come and go as they please. There's free trade. He's naming all of these things that sound very libertarian in principle. And I'm going, hey, this sounds pretty good. But once you start digging into it, a major part of the Greek culture back then was that it was not based on the individual, as we would see, especially in Western civilization. We take pride in individualism. It was not that way at all. They were extremely community oriented, to the point where they would actually kick people out or ostracize people from the city if they were too smart or too wealthy or too handsome, because it makes everybody else look bad. So you could actually be ostracized from your city because you were too good looking or you were too charismatic.
What?
Yeah.
Well, I'm screwed.
You will.
Can you imagine? Never before has there been such a large population of great looking homeless people.
Oh yeah. I mean, they could just start their own commune out in the wilderness.
Right.
So another key point to their culture was that you can't speak, you can't even think, and this will be important down the road when we start talking about the table flippers. But so you can't speak and you can't even think bad thoughts or against your city. So the sanctity of the city is tied directly into not only the community but also their religion. So you might know that each city was dedicated to a different god, a different deity. So because of that, it was kind of like your professional sports team, right? So I'm a fan of, the Tennessee Titans. So I cheer them on. They're out of Nashville, so that's kind of how it all ties together. In the same way, each city would have a major deity. So because of that, if you were talking bad about your city or even thinking bad thoughts about your city, you were essentially slapping that god in the face. And so in that way, the city, the deity, and the community were all intertwined, and they were all seen as sacred. So again, if you were doing anything against that city, you're doing it against the deity, you're doing it against the community, all to emphasize that their culture was extremely based on the community as a whole rather than the individual.
So if I could stop you for a second, just
Yeah.
what I find interesting about this, just some commentary on what you just said. When you think about it, this is fascinating to me because, back then, if you found yourself in a different city, it was probably not going to be a great thing for you.
Right.
Right. The different cities are obviously, these people are going to have different cultural norms, different things that they go about. So that's probably going to be really foreign to you. And based off of what we know of the past, to be probably an opportunity to be violent for you as well. And especially so when you're outside of a city. So this makes sense because people's lives are entirely tied to, their livelihood is entirely tied to these cities. And outside of them, I can't imagine, life is going to be very good. So that's interesting. It's not like today, right now you can move from a suburb in Illinois to a suburb in Michigan, and your life isn't as drastically altered as it would have been, moving a similar distance back then.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, you got to remember this is the time of the city states. So it's not too far time-wise from the time when, most human beings were nomadic. Of course, then they discovered agriculture and, we don't have to move around for our food. But even past that, it took a while for people to progress to organized cities. So you had Babylon, Egypt, all these different places. But then the city states were a bit more unique than that. Because even in, the Egyptian Empire or the Babylonian Empire, but instead of an empire, this was just almost a country the size of a city, and that was about it. And even though they were in relatively close proximity with one another, because of these pretty extreme cultural differences, they were always warring with one another. Every now and then they'd team up and, kick the Persians' asses or whatever. But generally, if you belonged to one city, you wouldn't really, mess around with another city unless you wanted to start something a lot bigger than just you.
Right.
Sorry, I'm just going to roll through some of this because I love talking about it.
Please do. Yeah.
So basically, when we're talking about the major Greek philosophers, their primary focus as compared to the later political philosophers was on these kind of very lofty ideas like what is truth, what is justice, and they would debate these things at great length. So when you're reading a lot of this material, if you're reading, Plato's Republic or the Allegory of the Cave or all of these different materials, it's incredibly dry to the point where you're reading a conversation. There's a group of guys sitting around a fire and, one guy is using the Socratic method. So basically walking his debate opponent through his own argument. So saying, so do you agree that this is true? Yes, I agree that this is true. So if you agree that this is true, et cetera, et cetera. But the way it's written, it's like a back and forth where it's totally unnecessary. So it's a little bit dry. It's hard to read. But anyway.
It sounds like if Mises adopted the Socratic method. Mm-hmm. He just spends the whole time arguing with himself.
Oh, I mean, the Socratic method is an amazing tool for debate and just kind of getting your thoughts out there. But the way it's written is just god awful. I mean, obviously it's from, ancient times and it's been translated God knows how many times. But anyway, so they're constantly debating about what is truth, what is justice, what is good, not in a moral sense necessarily, but what is best for the community as a whole. So, for example, when they're talking about the city and speech in Plato's Republic, there's not really a compass as far as what is morally correct or what is best for the individual. It always comes down to the community. So, for example, they're talking about this hierarchy of this city that they would build. If what would be the perfect city? What would be the perfect people? And so they're laying all of this out. Okay, this sounds good. That sounds good. But then you get into some morally murky territory. At one point, they talk about how you would have to basically kill all of the adults or otherwise get rid of them once you've built the city and then indoctrinate the children from the ground up because otherwise they're going to know different and it's not going to work. So you're just kind of going, wow, I mean, I guess it's still best for the city, but that's the really dark stuff. Or they'll talk about what is truth. Again, with no use for morality in this case, as we understand morality. Truth would just be, well, this person believes this person believes that. So what is truth anyway? Anyway, all of these very lofty things. So when it comes down to it, all of these lofty things are also in the context of the gods, of the community. So again, totally different from what we understand as being politically important or politically valuable today. And that's when we get into Machiavelli. So before I step into that, what are y'all thoughts? What are y'all's thoughts so far?
It's very, very dark. You get into the killing all the adults so you can indoctrinate the children stuff. And I mean, it makes sense. It's interesting to me. It's fascinating to me because this is how, things operate when you're living in a time before a lot of these things have been established in practice for years and years. And it just kind of becomes, your operating altitude. Mm-hmm. This is a window into society. Before that, there was an operating altitude like that when it was free game to just question everything.
If I could jump in here. And it is very, very much like a image of the pre-Enlightenment world in which, like you said, the city-states had a deity connected to them because it does not take very much of an intellectual mind to say that, like, well, like this is the deity and like that represents everything that we are and we should worship it. And it's a very it becomes a very it has an imagery of this of a culture, and it's that's very much a method of control in a religious aspect, and something that we saw up until the time of the Reformation and the Enlightenment. And it's I think the Greek city-states exemplified this, to its 10th degree in the way that it was done. And we can see this playing out in some of the more brutal city-states, such as Sparta, mm-hmm. in which, the social control in the name of a religious or dogma is very much a part of their culture, mm-hmm. and makes them and compels them to do things that I would say that people generally would not do unless they were indoctrinated into this system. And like you said, there was people that were kicked out because they might be too smart. And so it's a self-perpetuating system. And I think when we're talking about like liberty, and when it stems back to the ideas of the, Greek city-states, there was definitely parts that didn't.
Oh, absolutely.
There were definitely parts that did not exemplify liberty at all.
So, yeah. And I think it's important to focus on, have a clear picture of who they actually were. They were fallen human beings just like anyone else. So instead of kind of putting them up on a pedestal and saying, yeah, they gave us democracy and they gave us, all of these other different things, they did give us those. They came up with some great ideas. Socrates wrote extensively about the different forms of government. Even back then, they were in very general terms. So you had, monarchy and democracy and, this, that, and the other. But, there was also a lot of really dark stuff, which in large part, I think was formed by their environment, of course. The way it was back then, how dangerous it was. Ultimately, you almost had to look out for the community as a whole. You couldn't afford to enable or empower the individual back then. But I think as we've progressed as a society and as a civilization, we've gotten to the point where we can afford to empower the individual over, give greater sovereignty to the individual rather than the community.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with it. So let's keep this train rolling. Tell us about Machiavelli.
Okay, so this is a huge turning point, and that's why I wanted to kind of set the stage with the Greeks to give the audience an idea of how drastic this change was. So having these things as your basis, it's based in the idea of community, the gods, what is truth, what is justice, all of these very lofty things. So Machiavelli looks around and he sees all of these great ideas that have been laid out, and then he just sets a bomb off in the middle of it. And he says, none of that crap matters. All that matters is yourself and what you can do for yourself. And of course, I'm referencing The Prince here. So for those of you that don't know, The Prince is basically a guidebook for how to rule. But it's not about how to rule morally or how to rule benevolently necessarily. It's about how to rule effectively. And there's no moral compass for this whatsoever. It's if you need to be brutal, then you will be brutal. If you need to sway the public on your side by gifting, grafting them or whatever the case may be, then you do it. But ultimately, it's about how to rule effectively, but most importantly, how to keep yourself in power. All throughout the book, there's a lot of different stories about how a prince might go about doing this. So one example is that he says, well, you have this city that is overridden with crime. So you put a lieutenant in place over that city to take care of the crime. And you say to this lieutenant, you do whatever you need to do to get rid of crime in this city. So the lieutenant obviously goes the easiest route and uses extremely brutal means to take care of the crime in this city. So he captures a criminal, he's executed, just sweeping the city of all the criminals. And hey, maybe some innocent people get caught up in it and they get killed too. But who cares? You're doing what you were told to do. So once this city has been cleansed of criminals, the prince comes back and he says, well, why did you kill all of these people? Innocent people were killed too. And he has this lieutenant publicly executed. So even though he knew that this guy was going to do all of these horrible things in order to serve the prince's purpose, getting rid of the crime, he also wants the people on his side so he can stay in power. And that's why he publicly executes this lieutenant, so all of the people see that justice was served in their name, or so they think.
Right. And Machiavelli in The Prince goes into, it's called The Prince because he touts the perfect leader as being a conquering prince, and he gives, throughout the various chapters in the book, he gives examples on whether on what the prince should do when he conquers specific things. And I think his commentary on conquered free states, if the prince was to conquer a free state, is quite telling to his philosophy, because he gives basically three options for what to do with this free state when the prince conquers it. And the first one is ruin them, like Rome destroyed Carthage. And then you exert your authority that way, to go live there and, install colonies, and because you're the prince of the republic and such and so forth. And then, or let them keep their own orders, but install a puppet regime above them. It goes along with the base premise of it, that is power must be maintained by the one who holds it. Machiavelli also described Moses as being a conquering prince. That he founded new laws and orders by a display of a grandiose display where he wrote the 10 Commandments, and then he exerted them by a massive amounts of force and even killing his own people to make sure that the laws were upheld.
Right.
It almost sounds like satire. It really does. But the thing is, as you said, it's a flipping of the table, and it almost sounds like he was just he was like the Trey Parker or Matt Stone of the day. He was really just trying to offend as many people as possible. Oh, okay, I haven't covered the Jews yet. Let me make fun of Moses.
Right.
It's just, it's very just extremely abrasive. But it's interesting to note that so many people have pulled from Machiavelli, and especially the Prince in particular, when it comes to things like foreign policy in the modern day. Mm-hmm. So,
well, and there's even a term that takes from his name that basically means like you're going to manipulate your way to your own ends, with no real concern for morality involved, as long as you are achieving what you set out to do. In a nutshell, of course, but gosh, there's so much to unpack there alone. I mean, the huge amount of separation between where the Greeks started with community, he's going to individualism with these lofty ideas of justice and truth. He's going to kind of the bottom rung and saying, no, none of that matters. It just matters about what you get on this earth. What can you get out of your life? He's going from deities to, if God exists, it doesn't matter. You're looking out for yourself and that's it. There's just so many drastic differences between the two. And as you said, it's just so abrasive. It is almost like he's just trolling everybody. But it begs the question, is he writing this as an actual sort of manual for people to follow? Is he writing it as a satire to show people what not to do, to show leaders what not to do? Or is he just holding up a mirror to humanity at the time and saying, hey, guys, this is what you're capable of. Look at history.
When I listened to what you guys, were talking about, what my first indication would be, or what my first guess would be, is it sounds like it's an observance of effective practices at the time. That's what it sounds like to me. Mm-hmm. Is it sounds like he was just outlining what he's observing, right? Like this is what you got to do. This is what people do. This is how people get ahead and stay ahead. And so if based off what I've seen, if you want to do that, this is what you do.
Exactly. And it's very telling that, we can't be sure why it was written or what he had in mind while it was written, but it's very telling that people, from political science majors to CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, read this and take lessons from it to meet whatever their ends are, whether it's finishing a degree or it's, having a hostile takeover of the competition. But they're drawing lessons from it either way. Same with, like the art of war and things like that. They'll get into this old, these old writings and pull lessons out of them to fit the modern day. And it could be for good things or neutral things or bad things.
Which the thing is, Sun Tzu was a brilliant writer at the time, but we have to take it in context. He was writing about actual military strategic, military strategy in the time in which he exists. So I think it's, I dare say that I think a lot of people take his writing out of context and try to apply it to different modes of, try to apply it to different things that I don't think that it was meant to be applied to. Of course, there is bits of the art of war that talk about ruling and, being a good commander and things like that. But I think the entirety of the book is military in nature and one that existed in that time.
Oh, certainly. Sorry, go ahead.
Are you trying to tell me that the construct of human interaction changes during a time of war? What?
The construct of human interaction definitely does change within an army. Mm-hmm. That's for sure.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But however, if we're going to talk about base individualism, it's been said in many war movies and things like that it doesn't matter, about why you're there. It's all about the guy next to you, stuff like that. So I think that kind of that base when we're talking about the individualism of a soldier or the humanization of, it's bad that I have to say humanizing a soldier, but is that is that it's all about really just about self-protection. And
well, yeah, I mean, human beings generally, I think the default is most people aren't giant fans of conflict. And if it's not to say that they're not all giant fans of it, I do believe that it's quite obvious that it does stir a certain amount of anxiety and intensity inside an individual. And I can only imagine what doing that on a much more massive scale with all the most powerful weapons in the world would do to change or ratchet up that intensity and anxiety.
Yeah, there actually is a quote that I'm actually looking up right now because I want to make sure that I get it right about how the general person doesn't really. Here it is. Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor that matter in Germany. That is understood. The people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That's very easy. All you have to do is tell them that they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works in the same way in any country. And that was said by Hermann Goering at the Nuremberg trials. So when we're talking about like kind of going back to the control of the city states and then also getting into Machiavelli more, we're talking about kind of the influence of the prince, the ruler, in the denying of human nature. If we're going to throw virtue out the window and say that, these noble concepts are not good or they're not relevant, then it begs the question to what works and then that is all that I would say Machiavellianism is bent on. But if that is to be said, then concepts of like human rights and all of that is gone. People are means to the end of the prince. And I would dare say that without the concept, if you remove the concept of control from Machiavellianism and take the philosophy in and of itself, it almost, correct me if I'm wrong, it almost sounds like Stirner's philosophy of egoism, because a little bit, yeah, because it disregards the virtues, like the notion of property and natural rights. So that's something for later, because that's a little bit more into the modern era that we're talking about.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot of tie-ins that we're going to see as we move forward. I mean, even your quote from Goering, I instantly thought of Rothbard when he's writing an Anatomy of the State, kind of using patriotism as a tool or as leverage with which to bring more people to your side or manipulate more people to support you. But let's don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. So we talked about Machiavelli. He totally kind of hit the reset button on political philosophy in a huge way. So then we have the Enlightenment period. And the three main guys that I want to talk about from the Enlightenment period are going to be Thomas Hobbes, which, Vinny, you're apparently not a big fan of.
Yeah, Hobbes is a fuck.
So Hobbes, John Locke, and
to put it lightly,
and Rousseau. And how you feel about Hobbes, I feel about Rousseau, but we'll get into that. But so Thomas Hobbes, he's a really interesting character, and I think we're getting into more familiar ground here between the three of us. So feel free to cut in. But basically, he came around and he said, okay, so let's talk about human nature. That was kind of the chic thing for philosophers at the time to talk about, or the nature of man. So Hobbes basically said, in a state of nature, man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So in the state of nature, no one can
basically. So according to him, dudes are just essentially what is portrayed by cleaning product commercials. Right, like you get the Clorox commercial, like no husband can ever do anything right, and everything's a mess.
Or not to get too racial here, but every white person in every infomercial, knocking always just like dropping stuff all the time, like his worldview is that people are essentially like all the losers in the infomercials that can't figure out how to like take their trash out without destroying their living room.
They smack their foreheads and shake their heads. Well, actually, that's not a bad analogy at all, because when he wrote Leviathan, his magnum opus, as far as his work is concerned, he makes the case that because of this nature of man, they can't take care of themselves like the husbands in the cleaning commercials. So they need a sovereign or a leader. It could be one person or a group of people, but they need a sovereign to take care of them. I guess in this analogy, it would be the wife. The wife comes in and says, okay, get out of the way. Let me clean this up for you. Let me take care of it for you. The wife would be the sovereign in this case. So man can't take care of himself. He will not survive in a state of nature. So we have to elevate ourselves out of that state of nature by forming a society. Now, once we form a society, we need to have a sovereign. And this is where social contract theory comes into play, which is just god awful, but it needs to be discussed. So the idea is that, okay, so we've come out of the wilderness and we've built this society. So if you just stumbled out of the woods and you see the society, then you have to make the choice if you want to be a part of that society, which would it would behoove you to do so because it greatly increases your chances of survival and reproduction. Then you have to swear ultimate allegiance to the sovereign. With very, very, very few exceptions. Namely, it's like the sovereign can't order you to kill yourself. The sovereign can't tell you what to think, which is an important distinction between thinking and speaking. They cannot tell you what to think, which was surprisingly revolutionary at the time. Not to get on too big of a tangent here, but in that time, you had all these monarchies across Europe, and it was illegal. Using air quotes here, it was illegal to think something against the king because the king had divine right. The king was anointed by God to be the monarch. So it much in the same way that if you're talking shit about the deity of the city in Greek culture, if you think something bad about the king, then you are by proxy thinking bad things about God and he's going to smite you or whatever.
Can you imagine the poor sons of bitches that were like, they're just like, I can't do it anymore. I had a bad thought. And then he just dies.
And then he just
all
boom.
All you had to do was just keep your mouth shut. But he's
lightning bolt.
So righteous that you just I can't keep it in anymore.
So for Hobbes to come along and say that, well, you were allowed to think what you want, but you can't say it, that was truly revolutionary at the time. But other than that, you had to follow along with whatever the sovereign said. And that's what we have a problem with, because you're removing free will from the equation. You're disempowering the individual for this, but they would make that choice for the sake of survival, at least in his mind. So he also laid the groundwork for natural rights. The idea that, you do have the right to life. You can't be ordered to kill yourself, that kind of thing. But that's really about where it stops. Other than that, you have to give everything to the sovereign. Whatever they tell you to do. If they tell you to go to war, you have to go to war. But he also cautions the sovereign that in a situation like if you're going to take your people to war, you have to make sure that it is for the right reasons, because then by going to war, you're going to fall back into this state of nature, this chaotic state. Now you're warring with one another, and that's counterproductive, because now you're not surviving anymore. You're not peaceful. So, even cautioning this giant, all-powerful sovereign was a step forward, because he's saying that, hey, your leadership isn't perfect, whatever form that may take. They're questionable. Their choices are questionable, which was huge at the time. Totally revolutionary. And
I think it's also very good to note the influence or counter that was made to kind of some of Hobbes' theories by John Locke as well. If that's moving down the line too much,
no, that's fine. I wanted to leave the floor open for y'all too. I know I'm talking a lot here. So any thoughts y'all have?
No, I'd love to change topics from Hobbes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you just hate Hobbes.
I'll take off, I guess.
You already mentioned it, right? The things that we as libertarians in the modern age disagree with in his philosophy. And I just disagree with it a great deal because of the logical conclusions that it goes to, which it goes without saying based off what you described. So.
Well, yeah, but let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, let's flesh it out just a bit. Because I'm coming from the standpoint of, like, contextually, I admire a lot about his ideas in the historical context. But ultimately, obviously, we would not want to copy and paste that into the modern day because of, the disempowerment of the individual and all of those sorts of things.
I mean, I contextually, I guess you could say that I see and I understand the position of where most modern people were at that time. I just fundamentally, I just disagree with this whole premise that everyone's a primate and they're good for nothing people that could do nothing if left to their own devices, while you are living inside the body of a good for nothing primate that could do nothing. It seems odd to me. A lot of those who support a lot of his philosophy seem to have philosophical opinions that I don't agree with at all. And the whole, obviously, the idea of needing to be, essentially to get in line, as it were, for things to move out, like, in an optimal manner. That's just not stuff I really like to get down with.
Oh, I mean, and to be perfectly clear, I wholly agree with you. I think it's just important that we understand that background, kind of the baby steps that he took towards our direction. But as far as his ideology or his philosophy in the modern context, oh yeah, I wholly disagree with everything that he said.
And I don't think it was much different then. You're just talking about people just the same way you're talking about people now, and people only know as much as they've been exposed to. And so when you're talking about people back then, you're talking about people that lived a kind of life where it was just different, right? And people were essentially parts of the environment that they were in. I'm not saying that this approach wasn't the most effective one at the time. Clearly it was, but mostly I take a large disagreement to the observance of the idea that, we're all just a bunch of dumb apes. I mean, in a sense we are, but I think the hat was hung on that a bit too much with his work.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely see that. So your main point of contention with him is his idea of the nature of man.
Yes.
Okay, why is that? Just out of curiosity, what do you think the nature of man is?
Well, I think the nature of man is largely based on incentive structures. And I think that, the incentive structure is what it is then. But I think that if people really were deep down just a bunch of crazy savages, we wouldn't live in the kind of society that we live in now. I don't know. Maybe this is like a super jaded point of view because of where I'm at in life. And I know that things in the past were much more barbaric than things are now, but that doesn't mean that people enjoyed that barbarism by and large. That doesn't mean that, that doesn't mean that people enjoyed that conflict by and large. So then it begs the question, in my opinion, are people inherently that way, or is that fight or flight? Are people being that way?
Did they know that it was barbaric?
I think so.
That's the other question, because if if the establishment of a controlled narrative is put in place by either a coercive entity, whether this be a centralized religious conglomeration, like we saw with the Church of England, the Catholic Church, or whether it's done with a monarch, with a very government that's been on very restrictive methods of control, such as that it's illegal to print books and things like that, unless it's done by the sanction of the church or from the state. And so I would argue that people were more concerned with the state of being and the relative status quo than they were with questions of whether it was barbaric or not. And this is where we kind of move into the situation of the Enlightenment, is where information was exploding and people started to realize that, the Crusades were probably barbaric, or that there is, that overtaxation of the people, or saying that you can't have a certain kind of bowstring on your longbow was a barbaric thing, and that barbarism was stemming from different aspects, but it was integral in the shift of different ideas on government. So I'm thinking, like, when we're talking about people of this very point in history, it's kind of a myriad of different ideas, because there definitely was more people that were more enlightened and that knew this than there were others. Commoners in England might have known it, but the peasants might have not.
But I think one of the interesting things here too is that the overlaying concept and all of this stuff that we've talked about up until this point largely revolves around controlling the narrative of society in order to get to your desired ends. And perhaps it's just the libertarian in me, but that to me is bothersome. And of course, like I mentioned, the perpetuation of that idea is bothersome to me as well, because, I just find it inherently flawed to tell people that they are broken and they are imperfect and they are useless, and without your leadership, they will remain to be that way and their lives will be for naught. Well, I disagree with that concept entirely.
Oh, as do I. But I think it's interesting to note, though, at the same time, that when you're talking about all of these power structures, especially in the historical context that we're looking at, Hobbes is basically, directly or indirectly, propping up every source of power at the time. So he's saying, with his philosophy, he's justifying the existence of kings. He's justifying the existence of the Catholic Church. Whatever power source is in existence, he's saying that is a good thing. It is necessary. And if they did not exist, more to the point, then y'all would just, be savages tearing one another apart in a state of nature. What
a bootlicker.
and in a way, this kind of ties back to Machiavelli, right? Because, Machiavelli is saying, use whatever you can to manipulate the people to bend to your will to meet your ends. And so Hobbes is just kind of the middleman in that exact same scenario. Hobbes is just doing it for the people that are in positions of power.
Yeah, but see, in my opinion, Machiavelli's approach is more observational and has far less hubris involved in it than the approach of Hobbes, right? The approach of, and I think maybe that's it. Maybe that's the core of my issue, is that the kind of arrogance that it takes to kind of state some of the things that he states as concrete premises for the rest of your work says something about the individual, right? If you look at Machiavelli's work, none of it was necessarily stated that the stuff we went over wasn't about, well, if people are this, then you have to do that. It's just about, look, this is what you got to do to keep this game rolling. You're in a game now, and this is what you got to do to keep the game rolling. which is one thing, right? And then you can kind of okay, I appreciate the honesty there. Someone mentioned Stirner. That's kind of the same vein that Stirner's in. Is it's just this kind of an observation of reality that's got a different look at it, but it's not casting judgments, which really kind of casting that's people are inferior and you're at this different level of things. It's just all very pompous and yeah. I don't know. So
I have to ask the question, because you said like making assertions, or I can't remember the exact. I know it was only a couple seconds ago, but I can't remember the exact terminology that you used. But making assertions on what human nature is, or what the plight of man is, as it were. Would you also take kind of that unbiased method towards what Locke said, where he quotes that he says that human nature allows people to be selfish? Do you think that's an overreaching
I don't
assertion?
think so, because that again seems to me to be more of an observation of the nature of things. Mm-hmm. It's tough. Mm-hmm. It's tough because the statement with Hobbes is also probably like an observation of the nature of things, but it's something that's like, it's a kind of a situation where it's like, okay, we've got this narrative and we've run this narrative. And in order for this narrative to work, you people need to be the people on the bottom that I stand on so I can get these things done that are going to put us in a better situation for everybody. Mm-hmm. Right. But it completely ignores the fact that narrative might have something to do with the crazy shit that you're talking about. The fact that you're constantly living your life on the backs of other people might be the reason that they're a little insane.
Right.
And so that's my problem there. With something more like Locke, I think it's more of an observation of how things could be compatible. Mm-hmm. Whereas it's like, hey, you've lived your whole life as a slave under the force of someone else to meet their ends. The hell is wrong with you animals? Like, that's just, it's offensive to me. Pretty vulgar.
Well, now that Vinny's spun up, I think it's a good time to move on to John Locke. So John Locke basically said, that the state of nature of man should be that they are free, equal, and independent. And I think that's a perfect place to start because, for our American listeners, if Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, if they are our founding fathers, John Locke is basically our founding great-grandfather. If you read his work and then you read the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and, the Declaration of Independence, you're going to see so many parallels because the founding fathers drew directly from his work. So that being said, let's go ahead and dive into that.
It's kind of interesting that the establishment of even the establishment, but the existence of the central authority, or that the state is, like that it is according to Hobbes. That is what exists. With Locke, it's more like people establish a civil society to resolve conflicts in a civil way with the help of a government to do that. So it's more based on the fact that it is bent on the individual, like not bent, but it is the central idea to it is the individual will, is the individual human nature. And he characterized it as life, health, the right to defend his health, life, liberty, and possessions, which it was, of course, articulated in the Declaration of Independence as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, parallels that are just insane between the Declaration of Independence and Locke's thinking. He also came up with the ideas of separation of powers and between governmental entities, which was very revolutionary at the time because a monarch or a dictator was a monolith, and it had been for most of human history, maybe with a few exceptions, where it's like, okay, well, the people at the top say this, so that's the way it is. Sorry. And sorry, not sorry. And so the separation of powers was a very revolutionary concept at the time. And the fact that the people in quote control have to answer to other people who are also in control of another aspect. And so I dare say, though, even like, and I'm of course biased, is that that idea kind of lends itself in stepping into the door of oligarchy. What do you guys think about that?
There's a lot to unpack there, man. So you touched on an interesting point that I want to flesh out a little bit more, and that was kind of where is this power derived from? So this guy has to do what this other guy says, who reports to this other guy, you know. So if we go back to, let's say, ancient Rome, you had the Senate, you had the emperor, but the power was truly derived from the army, right? So if you had the loyalty of the army, you knew that you were really in charge.
Yes.
In, you know, medieval times, the power was derived from God. You know, as we were talking before about the sort of divine right of kings. You know, well, my authority comes from God, and everyone said, oh, well, I mean, you know, we're all Catholic here, so we're going to follow you if God says that we're supposed to. So John Locke kind of flips all of that on its head, and he says that, well, you know, let's give power to the individual, and that is where the power will be derived from with their government. So it's not that this government is to have ultimate authority. It's that the government is borrowing power from the people because the individual is the most sovereign entity. Of course, that's not even getting into his ideas on property rights, which are just, you know, were so hugely, you know, such a huge change, a drastic change from the beliefs at the time. Vinny, do you have anything you wanted to talk about?
No, see, you know, I tried my best to get into a bit of Locke. You know, I have, as I'm sure most people know at this point, I do have kids. So, and I commute to work. So my time to sit down and turn pages is not vast. So a lot of this stuff I digest via audiobook. And man, his was super tough. His stuff is always super, super tough to get through because not only is it, you know, written, spoken in a different way. Like these dudes that make the audiobooks always try to get cute with it, and they get someone who is somewhat close to speaking the way that they did when that was written, and it just ends up like, henceforth and now forevermore it will be known that these rights passed on to every man from his birth. And I just get lost super quick.
Like, did you take your cues from John Cleese, or like what the hell is going on?
And he brought forth the holy hand grenade, and
everyone was happy.
And spake unto him, pour thy pin on thine holy hand grenade, and count
not one,
and
not two,
to count 3.
4 is way off.
Thou shalt not count to 2 unless thou proceedeth to 3. 4 is way off. Just like God.
Yeah. And you know what, though? I think it has a bit to do because when I got into Locke the first time, I had just finished The Wealth of Nations, which took
it's too much.
That was such
it's
a
too
marathon.
much.
Adam Smith.
Yeah. And I got into Locke, and I was just like, I'm done. No more of this. I can't do this right now. So this is new. I'm learning a lot. This is some stuff that I mean, obviously I'm familiar with the core principles of the positions of these individuals that we're speaking about, but to learn a little more details about their work is interesting. I might have to dive back into Locke now that I didn't just get through a wall of Adam Smith.
I mean, I'll be honest with you. You could probably just look up some summaries of his work and learn more about it than actually reading the work itself. I'm really glad I operate under a pseudonym because my political science professor would be very upset with me for saying that. But So as far as his property rights, his idea on property rights is concerned, it's really fascinating to me because, I mean, we already touched on how heavily he influenced the founding fathers with the idea of individual liberty and every man being equal and all of these sorts of fundamental things that we understand now. But his idea on property rights, a little bit of trivia, he actually had business interests in my current home of South Carolina while it was being colonized, and everyone's excited about this new world. And so he saw the new world as an opportunity. So he said, there are these masses of lands over there and it's unclaimed, untamed. We can go over there and we can take it and we can make it ours. So that naturally lent itself to this idea of what he calls mixing your labor with the soil, right? So you go over there, you find a piece of land, and as you mix your labor with the soil, whatever the result is of that mixture, whatever the result is of your labor, you own that. And that is yours, and no one can take it from you. You do not have to give part of it away as tribute to the king or the local lord. No, that is yours to do with as you please.
Right, and this is the part of his work that I'm far more familiar with, and this is also the part of his work that obviously, to anyone listening, is a core function of what we believe in with our libertarian principles and ideas. So this is essentially the foundation of property rights as we know it today, private property rights.
Yes, absolutely. And that was just so hugely, I'm repeating myself at this point, but I'm just always blown away just thinking about, like, what kind of balls would you have to live in that time, in that setting, in that political environment, no less, and to just come out and be like, yeah, the king doesn't own everything. You can own your own stuff.
The gas,
and no one can take
like everybody's like, what did you just say?
The pearl clutching.
Yeah. What about the children?
He's a witch. May we burn him?
You know what? I bet he thought Hobbes was a fuck too.
Now who's waxing on assertions? Gosh.
All right, you're right.
That is funny though. Well, I mean, I don't know enough about whatever sort of writings he has on Hobbes specifically, if any. But he probably would have just very openly disagreed with a lot of the stuff that Hobbes said. So I think that's fair. I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, they're extremely different philosophically.
Yeah.
But they also had a lot of similarities just in terms of they had similar views of the basic nature of man. They just had totally different ideas of what man could achieve in order to come out of that state of nature. So, I mean, it's not quite as drastic, at least in my mind. John Locke's idea of man wasn't quite as brutal as Hobbes, but he still saw man as basically fallen creatures, for lack of a better term. They're selfish. They're going to look out for themselves. When he saw kind of the rise of currency, well, not that he saw it as it was happening. I mean, obviously that's when you're going back to like ancient Babylon or whatever. But, he saw currency as a symptom of human depravity, of selfishness, these sorts of things. So they had some similar views, but as far as the power of the individual, obviously totally different perspectives.
Yeah. And it's often quite touted that an essay concerning human understanding, this is one of his works, marks the beginning of the Western conception of the self, of the individual. So it's kind of extremely influential on like Western culture, and especially in the United States. One passage of the I'm actually going through the Wikipedia just so that I'm not plagiarizing here. One passage of the second treatise is reproduced verbatim in the Declaration of Independence. So it's in reference to the long train of abuses as found in Declaration of Independence. So it just extremely influential on the United States and in the establishment of the government. So,
well, let's move on to.
So where does that bring us?
Well, I think it would actually be good to like backtrack a little bit just to not leave this out, because we made no mention of the Magna Carta. Yeah, like the Great Charter of 1215. So basically, the idea that basically this challenged the idea of the effect that it had, going forward from 1215. I just kind of want to do this real quick. Is that the whole idea of the king owns everything, and so this challenged like that idea that no, there are certain things in which an individual does control. You do not control everything. So that's kind of and there was also things in there about wars at the time and the king not saying that he wasn't exerting his own force, but allowing or funding certain barbarians to come in and exert his will on a certain area. And the barons of the certain areas did not like that. And so they got together with the church and the Archbishop of Canterbury, along with these land barons, drafted what we know as the Magna Carta, which is actually the full name is Magna Carta Libertarianum, which is the Great Charter of Liberty. So I feel like that's good to note. Okay.
Oh yeah.
So go ahead.
Real quick. I mean, one of the big revolutionary things about the Magna Carta is that it sort of cemented the idea that every man's hearth, I forget the exact wording, but basically a man's home is his castle. Obviously not what it actually says, but it talks about the hearth and the home and how that is a man's sanctuary. It's almost sacred. So that, of course, sets the foundation for personal property as far as land ownership and your home. And kind of this idea of sanctity within that should not be lightly abused. I think that's a key point to point out. Do y'all want to talk about Rousseau? I really like Rousseau just because he's the oddball.
Weren't you saying that he's the one that you felt the way about him that I feel about Hobbes?
Yeah, he is a fuck.
Tell me why. Tell me all about it.
Oh, okay. So I've got this love-hate relationship with Rousseau. I really do. So basically, he broke away. He was an Enlightenment philosopher, but he broke away from Hobbes and Locke in his view of the nature of man. So he espoused this idea of the noble savage. Basically, he said that in a state of nature, man is perfect. But so, and this is where it gets really interesting, and this is where kind of my love of his philosophy grows, but at the same time, I'm just like, it doesn't make any frickin' sense. But so basically, his idea was if you're an anprim, then you're living the perfect life. So there's no society. You have your basic needs.
Oh, Jesus.
So you need to eat, you need to sleep. You need security, you need to reproduce, and that's really about it. That's all you need to worry about, and life is perfect because you can just focus on those things, and that's it. But as soon as you start interacting with other human beings to the point where you're forming, social networks and society, settlements and this sort of thing, that is when everything starts spiraling downhill from this glorious mountaintop of barely not being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. So as soon as, so you got these basic needs, but as soon as you start forming a society with other people, you start having wants. Well, I want friendship, or I want a bigger house, or I want, better tools or whatever. then those wants over time become needs. And then, so that's your new focus. And as these things grow, you're living more efficiently. So you're not constantly worried about hunting and gathering food. You've become more efficient at fending for yourself. So now you can focus on other things. Well, now I need forms of expression, I want forms of expression. I want to dance. I want to sing. I want religion, for example. And then those wants become needs. I need religion. I need to think about why the world is the way it is. And so his idea was that as these things grow and you keep climbing this ladder and building more and more society, it's corroding the original idea or the original nature of man. So where it gets really bizarre is basically he says that in order to return to that state, you have to tear everything down, because society is what's causing all of these evils. So you're greedy or you're envious of your neighbor because of society. Society made you that way. You have strayed too far from your perfect state. So you need to get back to that.
Yeah, he's
a fuck. So this was. And the main tie-in that I want to make with Rousseau's philosophy, which I think is fascinating, but also just god-awful, is that Marxism draws directly from Rousseauian philosophy. This whole idea of society and we all need to be equal. These sort of worldly distractions are pulling us away from what we're supposed to be, what we're meant to be. So 2 points in history, besides, all of the examples of communism that are particularly egregious are, for one, the French Revolution. So the French Revolution was directly tied into Rousseauian philosophy. And a lot of historians will compare the American Revolution to the French Revolution because it was similar cultures. It was around the same time. So why were they so drastically different? Why was the American Revolution so controlled? And this glorious phoenix came out of the ashes, and then glorious bald eagle, I should say. But then the French Revolution was just massacres and blood in the streets and chaos. And why was it so different? And it's because of Rousseau. So the French revolutionaries said it's not enough to overthrow the king and the aristocracy. We have to kill all of them. We have to tear down, all of these monuments to monarchy. They even reset the calendar back to zero because, it's not enough to tear down the physical things. We also have to destroy these non-physical things like the idea of time. Start from scratch, start from zero. That's the only way we can get to the point where we're supposed to be. So that's the first egregious example in history. The second is, and this is going to get dark, the Cambodian genocide. So Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, basically the leaders of that whole movement were classically trained, traditionally trained. Pol Pot himself was, I think he had at least a master's level degree in France. So he had all of his schooling done in France. And then when he went back to Cambodia, he brought a lot of those ideas with him, along with Marxist ideology. So he came in and he said, well, Rousseau taught me that we need to tear everything down. So that is what led him to not just form a society, a communist society like Lenin did, or even like Stalin did. Pol Pot was even more brutal than that. But it was driven by Rousseau's philosophy. So he said, let's take all of these people out of the cities. I'm going to take the teachers, the artists, the doctors. I'm just going to straight up execute those guys because they're too powerful, intellectually or expressively, whatever. And everyone else, I am going to strip them of all of their personal possessions. I am going to shave all of their heads. Their clothes will be dyed black, all of them. So he's systematically removing every instance of individualism from these people. He's stripping it from them, literally. And then he moves them out to agricultural labor camps. And, all these people from cities have no idea how to farm. And millions of people starve and die and are tortured. But all of that comes from this idea that we need to tear it all down. We need to get rid of all of it because it's all causing this evil. But
right, because it all stems from that basic belief that we keep coming back to, that people are somehow broken and you got to fix it. That if left to their own devices, human beings are just too screwed to get things together right. And it's got to be fixed. And what we've actually seen is the exact opposite.
Yes.
What we've seen is when people have freedom to go about doing things in pursuit of happiness and that protect their life, liberty, and property. That's when these societies actually flourish and prosper and are made prosperous.
You make an extremely interesting point. It's actually one that I haven't thought of before. The idea that, so obviously John Locke and Thomas Hobbes are going in one direction. They're going from a state of nature being chaotic to forming, at least in their minds, order through government. Whereas Rousseau is going the exact opposite direction. He's saying society is what's causing all of this evil. We need to go back. But in both scenarios, they're trying to reach their idea of perfection, not necessarily perfection, but of good through authoritarianism.
Right.
So this was kind of exemplified later by Bastiat, and it was kind of counter to Rousseau. Was that, and he said that the state should be only a substitution of common force for individual forces. And so that not only the fact that government should be limited, it is not limited, it is not the end all to be all of the social order, but that it is actually in direct, it stands directly in line or like against the social order, and that the social order is bent on individual methods, and that he asserts that the law becomes perverted, and that when it punishes one's right to self-defense, and also when it becomes in favor of legalized plunder. And so when we talk about legalized, and I feel like that sentence of it, that in and of itself, like that there can be good coming out of something that is bad, that there can be a sense of altruism coming out of stealing money from people or conquesting over other lands. And that, oh, well, it does good for people. Well, he has a quote where socialism, like the ancient ideas from which it springs, confuses the distinction between government and society. And so he was countering the idea that that we are the government, that everything is inclusive. And I think this is kind of where we're getting on the cusp of modern liberalism and libertarianism. It's where we're kind of getting, we're getting ideas that are not necessarily like just the establishment of these certain ideas, but I feel like Bastiat, and especially the law in particular, brought in a lot of these perceived ideas, and they still ring true today. What are your guys' thoughts about that? Sorry if I'm kind of moving this along too fast, but if you guys want to go back to Rousseau for a little bit, that's good too. But Bastiat.
No, I think it's relevant, and I think it makes sense. I think I'm not entirely sure how much you'd be skipping ahead by going to Bastiat, but I think when you talk about his work, it is much more in line with the things that we talk about today. What strikes me as a primary difference in his work and the work of others is it's now you can tell that the discussion of political philosophy is moving away from how do we perfect this? All of these different things that we've talked about all kind of center around, as has already been stated, the whole idea that, preserve the society. And then you've got Rousseau with his different opinion. But we've established he's a fuck. But these whole things of how you can control and manipulate society to the desired outcome. And now, you're finally breaking into a realm of thought that's challenging that's questioning it, that's putting it under a microscope and saying, is this really so effective? We've now got all of this evidence of how these things go, and perhaps it's not as optimal as was once thought.
Right. And so another thing that he challenged was like the infallibility of the legislature, of that if the public becomes socially engineered by the legislature, then he must bend to the legislature's will. And he uses the euphemism like the clay to the potter, which is kind of religious sounding. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that was intentional. Like that you're treating this like it's a god. You're treating this like it's infallible, like that it directs every part of your life almost like a deity. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of plays back into the Greek states as well. They had a deity to just completely represent the conjoining of the society with the government. And, it was blasphemous to say something against it.
Absolutely. So, well, I think that's an interesting point. To go back to something that we were talking about off air before we started recording, is this idea of people trusting in the state almost like it is a god or it is the god. It seems like in human nature, there's a part of us that needs something to fill that role. We need a deity of sorts in one form or another. You might call it a God-shaped hole in the soul of man. So that we're going to fill that with something. So maybe it's with, the God that is dedicated to your city, or it is, the Christian God, or it is the state. And I think that's certainly what he was getting at. But at the same time, it certainly rings true in the modern day. Without government, who's going to build the roads, which is no shit an argument that somebody in one of my political science classes made the other day. Well, if we didn't have government to build the roads, then we would all be driving on dirt tracks and bridges that are falling apart. They see...
Right, because no one needs to get around.
But think of the way that phrase that term is used. Right. The government. So the government is made of what? Mm. It's made of people. So what you're saying is that people need to build the roads. I agree. However, it's when it's phrased like that, the government. It's almost like this doesn't come out of magic, people. And like Bastiat says, like legalized plunder, that is the source of how the government, those in government, build the roads. If you're opposed to legalized plunder, then what is the options? Let's discuss that.
You're opening the conversation.
And there are options. Options, So.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's this whole idea when you look at it. So if you look at it from a perspective of this purely observational, the job of the state or the government, as I tend to want to prefer to call it the state, but the job there is really to allocate funds. Right. All throughout history, it's to allocate funds so you can do incredible things, because we've found that it's really hard to do, big, crazy things unless you've got a significant amount of wealth. Mm-hmm. And that's not very common. Right. And so in order for things to be not just, densely placed, and so this whole redistribution idea, and then you've got the government that basically just kind of serves as a vessel to collect and allocate funds. I was talking about this earlier. What's interesting about this is now we have a blockchain technology. And it's funny because you'd think, okay, what the hell does cryptocurrency have to do with what we're talking about? But if we actually don't necessarily focus on the currency so much and actually look at the idea of a blockchain technology, it makes it possible to do exactly that, but in a decentralized manner, which is fascinating. Because it acts as a ledger, it acts as a base, it acts as a place where you can pool things, where you can pool, be it data, where you can pool funds, any kinds of things. And you can do this without central control. It all operates in its own little environment without having to have central control.
And for those who think that, Vinny might be waxing philosophical or, kind of speaking in far out terms, look at what Lithuania is doing right now. I would compel our listeners to give a quick Google and just look up blockchain. Just Google blockchain Lithuania. It'll blow your mind.
Well,
so
all of this kind of ties in together, I think. So as we were talking before about where is the power derived from? So in ancient Rome, it was the army. Medieval times, the kings, it was divine right, this and that and the other. So even with something like blockchain technology, you're removing the power from a central figure. As you said, you're decentralizing it and you're re-empowering the individual. Hey, we don't need you to do this for us anymore. We can do it ourselves. But I would argue that a lot of people, in fact, I would hazard to say maybe even most people don't want that. They want the security of being able to depend on someone else or something else to take care of them. That's why people think only the government can build the roads or only the government can do any number of things. They want to fill that hole.
Yeah, but do you think that a certain level of that is right? So human beings are creatures of comfort, right? Okay, so have you ever been in a relationship and then you get out of the relationship and you kind of like lament the dumb shit that you shouldn't care about, right? You're just sitting there feeling sorry for yourself, and just because it was a part of your day to day, you're like, oh, she used to change the cat litter and now she's gone. Like some dumb, stupid thing, right? But the reason that you're really upset about it is because it's a departure from the comfort that you had in consistency, right? And that doesn't mean that defines you necessarily, and that doesn't mean that that's part of your human nature. The part of it that's your human nature is the fact that you derived comfort from consistency, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are useless to the world without that consistency. I would agree with you. I think it's hard to differentiate between the two for an individual. So, from the outside looking in, we can say, well, yeah, of course, that's not your identity. But for that person, maybe his significant other changing out the cat litter was just, that was just the highlight of his day. We don't know. Maybe he is genuinely crushed by all of that. And he did, in his mind, I don't envy him. But, at least in his mind, he did build his identity around that relationship. And in the same way, a lot of people take comfort in the consistency of government, whether that be, standing in line at the DMV for 3 hours, or, something good that the government might do. I don't know what that may be, but, to each their own.
I mean, when we get on this subject, I kind of think about like the people who are in the military or, some form of public service and then just like hated it, like, gosh, I have to, wait in line or have to like clean my weapon, clean my weapon completely spotless. And this is taking forever. But then they get out and they miss it. And it's just, and it's like a little thing like, oh, I don't have any food in my quarters. I'll just go to the chow hall and I'll get some chili mac that there's, some stupid thing that they're serving there. And now it's like, well, I have a kitchen and I can buy anything I want and I can make whatever food I want, but I still miss kind of going in a chow hall. It's kind of stuff like that where there is a certain status quo of regulation and control, and I feel like people fall into this comfortability with that, and in it so much to the extent that individualism becomes kind of tiresome.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, we joke about, I don't want to adult today, or it's too early to adult. It's like, we don't, right. To an extent, mind you, we don't want all of that additional responsibility. How much easier is it to just kind of let somebody else take care of it for us? Now, obviously, we understand the faulty thinking behind that and the danger behind that sort of thinking, but the temptation is there, certainly. Also, the cordon bleu at the chow hall was always pretty decent.
Right.
Oh, that is just awesome. And I know it comes out of the Cisco truck, and it's just better compared to everything else that is good, but it's just like everything else, but it's just like the amount of childish giddy satisfaction that you get to smelling that as soon as you walk into the worn out, hinge bare doors of that cesspool of socialism is amazing.
It's the little things. It's all about the little things. So
it's all about the little things.
With this kind of trend that we're talking about right now with finding comfort in these different things. A little interesting tidbit of history is when the Bolsheviks really cemented their power base in Russia and formed the Soviet Union. I think in like the mid 20s, late 20s is when they started doing this. Is they would actually replace, of course, Marxist-Leninism. One of the foundations of it was atheism, of course. But the communists, the Bolsheviks, understood that the Russian people needed some form of religion. You can't just take away their orthodoxy and expect them to be okay. So they actually instituted a system where marriages, funerals, and christenings for new children, instead of being dedicated to God, I shit you not, were dedicated to the state. So you would have a red wedding, or you would have a christening where you christen your child and dedicate your child to the state. Like it sounds like something out of a bad, dystopian novel, but this is actual history. If you went to a funeral, instead of reading a Psalms, you would there was some line that they would say about how we're all equal in death or something, some bullshit like that. Fucking communists. But it further goes to the point that, I mean, everyone, we need something, so it's going to be filled with something. Is it religion, or is it the state? Well,
this is where I think the incentive structure plays a giant part, because people chase the incentives that are available to them. And I think that there's a whole bunch of incentives that exist right now that lead to apathy. All these programs, they don't have exit points. There's barriers to entry for a lot of these programs, but a lot of them don't have any kind of incentive structure that motivates people to get off of the programs and not need the programs anymore. And that's a problem, because it's changing the way people are motivated, and motivation is what makes the world go round. Motivation is the core of human productivity, and human productivity is what's brought us from where we were when we started this conversation. The people in those times, versus where people are now. It's people's motivation to be productive and to innovate and to compete and to do more and to be more. And I guess for me, I've been at both sides of the spectrum. I've been at the spectrum where I was apathetic to stuff and I was looking for someone else to solve problems for me. And I've been at the side of the spectrum that's completely opposite of that. And there's just, I just don't exactly buy the premise that people are inherently any certain way. I don't know if you've caught on to that during this episode at this point.
A little bit.
Yeah, I just don't buy the premise that people just operate in such a way that we can just throw a blanket on top of it and say, all right, this is essentially true for this group. I hate aggregates of group data in my work. You know, when I do analyses and stuff, I always want to go farther, want to go deeper. I want more details, and I need to understand things better. I want to understand any tertiary influences, because those always seem to be the bigger indicator of trends and change than actual behaviors themselves. It's just people being as people have always been, reacting to environments that they are in and situations that they're placed inside of, be it for whatever reason. And so whenever we get into kind of statements as like, well, don't you think that people are generally, and my answer is normally always no. Like, I think that people generally want better for themselves. And it's all a matter of what kind of structure they sit in front of to get that better for themselves. I think that if it was harder for people to do better for themselves, people would just work harder to do better for themselves. I don't think that people would just stop wanting better for themselves.
But in order to get to that point, you have to remove even the temptation of leaning on somebody else to take care of whatever it is that you need done. And I think we could.
Well, I wouldn't say that you have to remove it so much as that you have to stop making it the primary mechanism. Right now we live in a day and age where it can be leaned on as a primary mechanism. I'm not taking kind of like the vulgar libertarian approach that says you could do it all by yourself and you just need to have a good work ethic. It's not so much
pull
that
yourself
it's
up
just
by your
that,
bootstraps. Yeah.
Right. Well, and I do believe in that. I do think that, but I don't hang my hat on it philosophically. I just think that it exists in people to respond to change. It exists in people. You know, people are like, we respond to, so people, a rubber band. Okay. A rubber band is the best way to say it. So there's a rubber band, and at a certain point you can stretch a rubber band, right? And it's just fine. And it's actually good. And you're getting good use out of it, and it stays flexible and it stays moving. But the longer it just sits there, it can dry up and it doesn't move as much, and it becomes less flexible, and it becomes less of what makes it good at what it is. And there's a certain point when you stretch it too much and it can break. And I feel like human beings are a lot in the same way. I feel like without any pressure at all, we become sedentary, we become stagnant, we become lazy. And I feel like with too much pressure, we can break, and anxiety takes over and manifests itself in many different kinds of mental disorders that are very real, and people have trouble with it. And I think there's a good amount of that going on right now with too much pressure, and everyone's got a fucking anxiety disorder these days. And I think it's due in large part to a lot of, you know, what we've got going on in society. But a certain amount of pressure is good. I can look back on my life and say that the changes that I went through and the things that happened to me that I resented at the time because they put pressure on me led me to be where I am now. And I love where I am now, and I appreciate where I am now. And I would much rather have what I have now than what I had before those hard times. So I think a bit of pressure is good.
I would say, though, that this becomes very seditious when we talk about government, because there are certain pressures and there are certain allegiances and control of those things that lend people to be faithful in certain things. And
sure.
William was talking about how the Soviet Union would, and their practices that replace religion. And in some ways, or not even religion, faith. If we're talking about an individualist thing. And I think in the modern sense, especially in America, we see there are quite many people who, on both conservatives and liberals, that view the state as being the state giveth and the state taketh away, a protector and provider, and very much attributing the roles of God to that of the state. And if you think about the practices in which in which people participate in it with kind of an open mind, it becomes very evident
that we're
worshiping this thing. we sing hymns to it and pray to it before we participate in sporting events. And I dare say that it becomes a point to where it's a very seditious thing where the state doesn't want you to do this. And so it's putting a pressure on you to do this, but you can do it this way. Mm-hmm. And it loves you for it. It's
subtle conditioning.
It's
the incentive structure.
It's subtle conditioning, and it's done under the guise, and it's very different in America than anywhere else because it is done under the guise of freedom.
Well, absolutely. That's why we name, all these policies that are antithetical to liberty and to freedom, things that make it sound like it's the most liberty first and freedom first thing in the world, like the Liberty
Damn it,
Act,
I was going to make that joke.
The Patriot, all these things that are, all these things are always, marketed as being great for freedom and great for liberty, and they're the exact opposite. We're going a little long here. We're at a bit of time, so I think what we'll do is we'll cut it here, and then we'll pick up and continue with some of these modern guys. I know that if we tried to shoehorn in, starting with like Friedman and Rothbard and Hayek, we'd easily turn this into a 4-hour podcast. So maybe it's best to just cut it here and to dedicate the next episode. So for the next episode, we're going to have some of our friends on to talk about it. So we'll find some way to continue this part 2 here as soon as we can, because there's nothing I'd love more than to get into some of my favorites. With that said, speaking of good times had, before we go, I would like to mention that where would I be if I didn't talk about the hottest ticket in town coming, the Unconvention.
Yes.
That's right. Don't miss out. Friday, May 25th to Sunday, May 27th. So this is a big deal. Everyone in Liberty is going to be there. Half of them are going to be talking. I'm joking. There's not that many speakers, but there's Ron Paul, Larry Sharp, Nick Sarwark, Dr. Lee Heap Merritt, plus more. There's also going to be some kind of crazy steampunk ball that is going on there that should be a good time as well. So if you go... yes, sir.
And Caitlin will be there. We'll be running the Think Liberty booth, and there will be an exclusive, nowhere else, officially unofficial, unconvention patch that is steampunk themed. And you are going to, and we're going to have a special price for it. And we're also going to have plenty of merchandise there to, so that you can buy and win and everything. And, everything going on with the Unconvention, it'll be a great time. You'll be able to talk to me and insult me to my face, and so and make fun of me. So you definitely should come.
Yeah, we'll be there. I don't think I will be there, but Think Liberty will be there. The guys from Being Libertarian are going to be there too. It's going to be a lot of fun. Not only are there going to be great people in Liberty speaking, but there should be just about everyone in Liberty in attendance. At least as far as I can tell, everyone I've talked to is going to be at this thing. So if you go to their website, which is www.omahaunconvention.com, you can use the code Think Liberty, and that's going to get you 20% off. On top of that, they just cut their prices. So if you use that discount code for the 20% off, one person is essentially able to get into the door for $40, which is a lot cheaper than it was when they started. So again, that's omahaunconvention.com. Go check it out. Use the code Think Liberty to save yourself 20% off. Get in the door. Go rub elbows with everyone in the Liberty movement who is doing something, because they're going to be there. On top of that, don't forget to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/ThinkLibertyTL. We're on Twitter at Think_Liberty. I'm on Twitter at ThinkVinny. Chris is on Twitter at ThinkChrisOG. Caitlin, who's normally on this show but isn't tonight, is also on Twitter at Anarcho_Mom. Lonnie is on Twitter. I think it's just Lonnie_Dupree. I'm not sure. But you can ask him on the Think Liberty Twitter, because he runs that one, and he'll probably tell you what it is. We're also on Instagram at Think Liberty, one word. Chris, why don't you tell them how to find our Steemit and Minds account?
Yes, you can find us on Steemit and Minds simply as Think_Liberty on both platforms. We also have an introduction. We also have a special offer going on our Minds account where you can win a free T-shirt of your choice as long as you pledge your Minds points to us. At 2 Minds points a month, then you enter in a drawing to win a free t-shirt every month. So check us out there. And yeah, and our Steemit also is picking fantastic up. More content to come later.
All right, William, I know you got stuff to plug. Where can people go to find you and anything else
so I'm the host of the aforementioned podcasts Liberty Bites and Liberty on the Rocks. You can contact me on Twitter at William_Gadsden. Please engage me on there because it's gotten really boring. It looks like I'm not actually active on there, but I swear I still get the notifications. So check out my podcasts hosted on the Think Liberty Network, and keep a lookout for some upcoming content on a new platform that we've been working hard on for a little while now. We're very excited about it. I won't say a whole lot else, but when we do launch this new project, you will be sure to see it.
All right. Well, this was a good time, and we're going to give everyone some of their time back. Sorry we ran a little late, but this was a fun conversation, and I'm looking forward to the second part of it. So, on behalf of these great gentlemen that joined me this evening for this episode, whether or not you like it, we'll probably be back.